The people of Runcorn and Helsby have spoken. Enough is enough.
Think about the swing. Think about the change. This is heartland Labour Party. Their vote has collapsed and much of it's come to us. This is a whole different politics.
I get it. We were elected in to deliver change, and we need to go faster on the change that people want to see, and that's what I'm determined to do.
We now are the opposition party in the United Kingdom to the Labour Party, and the Tories, frankly, are a waste of space.
Hello and a warm welcome to Control-Alt-Deceit, Democracy in Danger, a podcast designed to dive deep into the threats facing our institutions and to ask just how much trouble are they in. I'm Nina Dos Santos, former CNN anchor and international broadcaster.
And I'm Owen Bennett-Jones, former BBC foreign correspondent, now teaching at New York University.
Well, this week we're looking at the victory of the insurgent right-wing Reform Party in a set of local elections across the UK.
And the numbers were significant, surprising, and prompt a question: is the UK facing its MAGA moment?
We'll be joined by a couple of people who know Reform and its precursors very well, and we'll be asking them if they can answer that question too. All that and more to come here on Control-Alt-Deceit.
Now, through the last century, the UK had a pretty stable two-party system, and it rested on this first-past-the-post electoral system. And just to give you an example of that, in the last elections, Reform, this party that's just done well in the local elections, won 14% of the national vote. But because of the first-past-the-post system, it couldn't break through. It got 5 members of parliament. Now, there is a point at which you get to a national vote level where you suddenly break through. If Reform can get to 25% from their 14%, they will suddenly not just have 5 MPs, they'll have hundreds of MPs. You know, Labour now has got a big majority in Parliament, massive majority in Parliament, but it only got 32% of the vote at the national election. That's how the system works. And we'll see, Reform believe they're getting close to that breakthrough.
Yeah, well, let's have a look at some of the local election results that appear to confirm that. Just a reminder that Reform captured territory not just from its traditional rival on the centre-right, the Conservative Party. Reform has traditionally been seen as more of a threat for them, but they also captured a seat in Parliament in a by-election in a safe Labour seat where the majority was something like 15,000 before. That was the Runcorn by-election that was the big win of the night in these local elections. And aside from that, they got 2 mayoral seats from Conservative heartlands and scores of council seats across the country as well. That's important because the centre-right parties, the Conservatives in the UK, have traditionally been viewed as very able to run local government, but they appear to have lost that particular crown. And so if the success of Reform were replicated on a national level, it appears pollsters say that they could capture up to 30% of the vote and eclipse one of the 2 main parties. What this means, Owen, of course, for you, me and our listeners, is that the UK could now be plunged into an era of not 2-party politics as we've traditionally seen, but now 4 or 5 parties vying for big splits in the vote.
Just to sort of hit that home, the way it's always worked in the UK, there were politicians like Farage, but they would join the Conservative Party. They would be on the fringes of the Conservative Party. They'd get some media attention. They may get a junior ministerial post, and that was it. And they get closed out. And the same on the left. There were radical leftist members of Parliament. Tony Benn's a great example. He would get Ministry of Energy. He was a very competent man. He got to cabinet level, but he was never going to get beyond that. The party closed these people down. That system of putting these people to the fringes of the main party seems to be ending.
Yeah, absolutely, it does. And what's really interesting about Nigel Farage and his various parties, because Reform is the culmination of 2 or 3 political iterations. It started out with the UK Independence Party, or UKIP, which campaigned for the UK to get out of the EU and very successfully pressured the Conservative government, so as I said, their traditional rival on the right, to engineer a referendum that eventually saw the country voting for that. Then immigration became the next big Brexit-like like issue. Someone who's been with Nigel Farage and has observed him up close as he engages in this one-party pressure politics system is Gawain Towler. He was a UK Independence Party UKIP press officer back in 2004. That was at a time when, remember, this party and Nigel Farage and his cohort only really had a Brussels pulpit to preach from. They weren't able to get seats at that point inside Westminster. Gawain is no longer a press officer for reform, but he's still a big supporter and advocate of reform. And I asked him, based on the results that we saw from these local council elections in the UK this week, what he thought the main attraction was for reform being able to broaden its base so much.
The polls that got us closest, I think, was electoral calculus, and they had us, I think, on 3 councils and about 400 seats. They were pilloried for being way, way too ambitious for reform, and yet they underplayed it by 7 councils and 250 seats. How many times has this happened? Polling companies underestimate the broader movement, and not just in the UK, but across Western world. I saw something this morning. Somebody was going, according to studies have done of the voters, the people who haven't done post-A levels in education reform were averaging 43%. But if they've got a degree, then it's only 19%. 1, only 19%. Hello. And 2, how many times do the establishment elite look down on the electors and then wonder why they vote the way they do?
So, Gawain, what do you think the attraction is for reform? Because you've been with the various iterations of what has now become this political party ever since it was the UK Independence Party.
It's what I call the tribe, in that people who have worked and voted and supported parties led by Nigel Farage over the last 20 years. It's certainly immigration, yes. And I think that the general malaise and the whole two-tier justice concept has struck home very strongly amongst those who feel that they're left in the second tier. So those things, the deindustrialisation forced by net zero is a problem we feel is very significant. It's as interesting that the GMB are now talking very loudly by net zero is bad for business, bad for industry, bad for employment. And it's interesting to watch a trade union sounding like they care about their members. It's been a long time coming. And the trade unions were captured just as much as the National Trust has been captured, and various other things have been, by those who go to university, get a job in Westminster, get a job with a think tank. And so there is that feel. But there's also, I think, and it was telling if you listen to the Vox Pops and some of the focus groups, there's they haven't stuffed it up. The others have. Give them a chance. The protest votes we garner are people who are broadly in our direction anyhow. It's very hard to vote for Farage if you hate what he stands for, because he's a very public figure.
How can reform deliver, though? I mean, the onus will be on reform to make sure that it can deliver.
Without a shadow of doubt, there's the scrutiny of those 10 councils is going to be greater than the scrutiny of any council for the last 70 years, because people are willing us to fail. There's a massive target on our back. Good. We're delighted. If we have the ambitions to govern this country, and we do, then we have to enjoy and relish the challenge of actually doing the job. When you have a party that has gone from, 40,000 members, less than 40,000 members this time last year, to 230,000 now, a lot of people there, they've just joined, they're keen. I do public meetings all over the country, and I turn up, and if I was to have a stack of pitchforks and I was to hand them out at the door as they left, they'd be off the way to London. They want to serve. The offer we will make in Westminster terms will be extremely talented. Might be difficult to whip, but they will be people who have achieved stuff. They've done things. And the range, the diversity of background, of skill sets, of knowledge base will be probably better than any major political party has put to the country for decades.
You talk about people with talent raring to go, but in the end, governments in Britain face public finances that are shot. Millions of people can't work because of mental health issues. There's an NHS which has, defied reform for decades. New governments come in with great hopes, and they all find it's very difficult to do stuff. These problems are massive. The small boats keep coming. How can you stop them? So why do you believe that if you actually got power, you'd be any different?
Of course, many of these problems are very difficult. Some might say intractable. But if one goes into politics with the idea that nothing can be done, nothing ever will be done, You go in with the belief that you can change things, you will make that difference, and you push and you fight and you bully and shove until such time as you get things to happen. The sort of, the government always gets through, there's nothing we can do. Of course, if that's the way you go in, nothing ever will happen. You've actually got, and a belief can't make everything happen, of course not. But without it, nothing ever will.
A belief is not enough, is it? I mean, that is the point.
It's insufficient, but it's essential. Without it, nothing ever changes. And if we're talking about something like immigration, stopping the boats and all the rest of it, and yada, 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 you don't stop the boats by putting a wall down the channel. You stop the boats by changing the incentive structure. We state categorically that nobody who arrives illegally or overstays will ever be able to claim permanent status or citizenship. That's it. You go back. End. How do you stop the boats? You stop it being worthwhile for them to come. Simple. It's not that hard.
It's not simple, is it? Because you can't deport them wherever you want because countries won't take them back. It's not simple.
Well, there's ways and means of doing that too. You can. If you really decide that is what you want to do, you can.
Would you describe reform as far right, as
No.
hard right, or just right?
No. We're centre right. We are very much patriotic, the family country community. But the family country community is great, but it does hit reality when it comes to free market economics, globalisation. We think that has been inherently damaging to the country in many, many ways. We think it has created this large proportion of the country who are left behind, and the fealty to the sort of the Davos man fealty that we feel when Starmer stands there and is asked Davos or Westminster, and he says Davos. Even Emily Maitlis was shocked, her jaw dropped. But if that's the attitude of the so-called left of centre party, the party of the working man and woman, well, they've decided they don't care about the working man or woman, and so be it. They're leaving space.
You've had a journey that has been between Britain. Brussels gave you your first political footprint in a parliament, and then now you have a footprint in Westminster finally. But it took Nigel Farage 8 attempts to get elected in this country. So what is the future? Is he keen on creating an alliance between the Conservative Party and Reform? Is that completely out of the window now that two-party politics appears to have been upended?
I think it's a pointless conversation for at least 4 years.
So that's not a no?
It's a no for the foreseeable future. There's no way a deal's going to be done. Absolutely no way. But if you then you look at what happened at the last general election. There was no deal done between Labour and the Lib Dems. Absolutely none. And yet the Lib Dems, if you wanted to get rid of the Tories, you looked at what was available and you voted for it. And so the Lib Dems did very well. Surveys have been done on Tory Lib Dem switches at the last election. 60% of whom, the most salient point was immigration. Now, they wanted to get rid of the Tories, and the Lib Dems were the vessel by which they could do so. At the next general election, it may well be that it looks like there's some sort of deal, but it won't be a deal. It's just people aren't stupid. Political parties often think people are thick, and we talk down to them, we think down to them. But at the last general election, how to get rid of a Tory, people made that decision with no deals being done. And it may well be what is essentially a very wide but thin majority that Starmer has may find itself put to the sword by people just looking at it and going, who's the best person to get rid of these guys? And you've got the Gaza independents and you've got the Greens in certain areas. They're being beset from all directions.
For people listening in Europe or the US, how would you put Reform's performance in these elections in that context?
Well, obviously, we're not. Maloney won the general election. We're not there yet. As with many things, you've got sort of international socialism is very similar in every country. The sort of patriotic parties that are popping up all over Europe are very different because they're local, because they're patriotic. They're very focused on their own country and their cultural background, their cultural history. And so there's a huge amount of difference between Vox, say, in Spain, and the AfD in Germany. There are significant differences between these parties. So they're not like with like. They just aren't. There are similarities. I think the similarity on the cutting down on mass migration is something that is shared by across the board. But that's largely because each of these parties feel it threatens their own culture. And their own cultures are different. Le Pen is much more from the socialist side of things when it comes to economics than, say, we are. The AfD is. There are very significant differences between these parties. What they share is a love of place. the sort of Glassman, they're somewhere people, not anywhere people. And we feel that much of the political elite across Europe and the UK and the Western world has become anywhere people. They don't really come from anywhere. They don't feel rooted. It's like the old ancien regime. The aristocrats of Europe were much more similar to each other than the people that they governed, and they lived in their villages and towns. They intermarried, and that you have a sort of ancien regime. And just going back one thing right at the beginning of the conversation, yes, immigration. I see that this election is, to a certain extent, and I said you wouldn't support us if you didn't want to cut down on immigration. You also don't support us if you are anti-Brexit. I think this was another Brexit vote, in the way that obviously the referendum was, the general election after that, the 17 general election, the 19 general election, the 21, and then the elections before the 2013 council elections, when you started to see UKIP really putting pressure on the Tory party to force a referendum. But the big difference from UKIP to the Brexit party to Reform is that Reform sees itself as a political party, a fully fledged political party. UKIP and the Brexit party were single issue pressure groups.
Well, that was Gawain Towler there, who was once a UKIP press officer in 2004. That was one of the precursor parties to Reform, and he's now still, as you can hear there, a big surrogate for Nigel Farage in the international media and a big supporter of the cause. What I thought was really interesting from that interview, Owen, was the fact that he didn't rule out a reverse takeover of the Conservative Party by Reform. He said, that's not on the agenda now. But he didn't rule it out as being on the agenda in future. That must be really terrifying if you're somebody like Kemi Badenoch and you're doing so badly in the polls.
The leader of the Conservative Party, yeah, sure. I mean, there's now a battle for the right-wing vote, and Conservatives, famously the most successful political party in world history. They've just had astonishing amounts of power, largely down to this electoral system. The left vote in Britain has always been split between Labour and Liberal Democrat, which has allowed the Tories to get big majorities with really mid-30s in the national vote. So, there are particular quirks in the electoral system that have produced their success to some extent. But, there's now a fight on the right. The other way to look at this, and the reason why I think, Farage may be about to break through, is that he is moderating. It wasn't long ago that he said, well, it was quite a while ago, 10 years ago, that he said that he admired Vladimir Putin's operations, the way he operated. Now he's backing Ukraine. It wasn't long ago that he was very, very strong on immigration. Now he's saying mass deportations are not possible. So he has moved from his childhood. I mean, I actually happen to know somebody who shared the next desk to him at school, a former BBC colleague, who tells me that he was very, very right-wing in those days. I mean, extreme right-wing.
Way before he had any sort of business or political career.
Yeah, it's been a journey to the middle.
Because there are some who say, look, this is just a convenient excuse for him to get noticed, to tack further and further to the right. But people who say this really is his ideology.
Well, teachers have said that, and it's not just my former colleague who reported that at Dulwich College, this private school he went to, that he was on the fringes of politics. And so he's always been about how he presents himself, how he comes across, how he appeals, like every other politician, how they get that centre vote, because without the centre vote, you can't win.
The other thing I'd say about Nigel Farage is that he's been very canny in being able to make his movement about him. One of the problems that the Conservative Party has had, even over the 14 years that it was in government, is that it had this tradition of internecine wars, where we had multiple Conservative leaders, especially after the Brexit vote, when they couldn't deliver Brexit. This is partly coming from the pressure that Nigel Farage was exerting on the right. They would just turf out their leaders time and time again. And Reform has done the absolute opposite. They have stuck with this particular man. And in fact, many people say that the movement wouldn't exist if he wasn't so omnipresent. Over the years, when I've been in Brussels and of course across the UK following Brexit and the run-up to Brexit, I've had the chance to see Nigel Farage up close, and I've got to say he is formidably popular and he is very, very impressive in his commitment to getting on the campaign trail. A couple of times I've had the chance to point out to him that, if you're campaigning only on one issue, it is a bit easier than traditional politicians who are having to take multiple questions about all sorts of problems. Here's a snippet of, the times that I've had a chance to listen to what he had to say.
truth of it is that the Remain campaign never stopped.
But the Leave campaign won, and you're here campaigning.
Well, because the Leave campaign thought the establishment would keep their promise of delivering Brexit. They're not doing it. So the Leave campaign, the People's Army that was the Leave campaign, has reconvened.
How confident are you that you can translate this into a national party?
That'll depend to a large... I mean, the answer is yes, we can. How successful it will depend to a large extent on whether we leave on October the 31st. Just as March the 29th became seared in people's minds as this big, important date, October the 31st is the same.
To those who say you're a one-message man, what's your answer?
Most important message we've discussed in this country for over 300 years.
Nigel Farage there on the campaign trail being chased around by Nina dos Santos, no less. Now, let's hear from one of his former colleagues, I should say former, because Ben Habib was the deputy co-leader of Reform. I mean, he was close to Farage. He has left the party and he wrote an article just now reacting to Farage's success in these local elections, saying, and this is a quote, "This is the rub with Farage's Reform. In pursuit of power, he's throwing principle to the wind." So, what did Ben Habib mean by that?
Taken me years to figure this out. But in my view, Farage doesn't have a settled political philosophical framework. His persona, his public persona, is one of the United Kingdom first, British national interest first, a nationalist, effectively, anti-immigration. But Farage, I've come to realize, is the ultimate political expedient. He's used his persona brilliantly to promote himself and to conjure up this image of what he is in the British electorate's minds. But ultimately, Farage will do what Farage needs to do to keep himself relevant in the public eye and to garner as much support as he possibly can. And so he has judged that actually advocating mass deportation of people who are in this country illegally is something that the British electorate won't wear, that it's something the British electorate won't like. And that's why he's pivoted on it. And that's why he finds himself at odds with Donald Trump, for example, and other leaders.
Farage describes having heard Enoch Powell, a British politician back in the 70s, who was very strongly associated with anti-immigration and used very strong language to describe his position. And as a result, was basically excommunicated from respectable British politics, if you like, at the time. And Farage has said that he saw what happened to Enoch Powell. He agrees with all his positions, but just realised that to win, he had to avoid coming across like that. And he had to avoid that kind of language, and he had to use moderate language and come across as a nice guy and not as a frightening guy. It doesn't mean he doesn't believe all the positions.
No, well, I completely agree that language is important and language shouldn't be used in a way that causes division. But I think it's equally important that if you believe in something and you have a set of policies in mind, that you don't hoodwink the British people, that you're clear about what those policies are. And I think it's perfectly possible to make the arguments for the deportation, for example, of everyone who's entered this country illegally. It's a perfectly legitimate view to have. I don't think it's an extreme view. Perhaps you and I will differ on that. But if that is Farage's view, if he does believe everyone here who's entered the country illegally should be deported, then I think he's duping the British public by saying otherwise. So at every level, he comes back to being a political expedient. And one of the issues I've got with the way politics has unfolded over the last 30, 40 years in the United Kingdom is politician after politician has put the need to get elected ahead of actually what they need to be doing for the country. And you might argue, well, Ben, they'd never get elected if they didn't do that. But at some point, politicians have to start telling the damn truth about what they believe this country needs to have done. And I didn't enter politics in order to simply go up the greasy pole of political advancement. I entered it because I think the country is in deep trouble and that we do need some drastic changes in the way that we're governed. And if Farage doesn't believe that, then I think his public persona is at odds with the man himself.
Isn't the other problem, Ben, that there is no other legacy other than Nigel Farage himself? That if anybody becomes too prominent, they're immediately ostracised from the party?
This is a huge problem, Nina. And again, I think it attests the point that I'm making, that it's all about making sure Nigel Farage is in the public eye and at the centre of attention. And, the reason Rupert Lowe was booted out, it's very simple. Elon Musk preferred Rupert Lowe to Nigel Farage. That's what it boiled down to. You remember the tweet that Elon Musk put out saying that, Nigel Farage wasn't fit to lead reform, but perhaps Rupert Lowe was.
Just to
Yeah.
explain, Rupert Lowe was a Reform Member of Parliament who fell out with Nigel Farage, and there's lots of sort of to and fro on it. But basically, he left Reform as one of the only 5 MPs they had. He left, and you're giving your explanation as to why that happened.
Yeah. Nigel Farage had made a big song and dance, in my view, prematurely, self-evidently prematurely, claiming that Elon Musk would donate $100 million to reform. And actually, Elon was nowhere near that in his own mind, because he came out denouncing Nigel Farage, endorsing Rupert Lowe. And then pretty much almost seamlessly from that point onwards, Rupert Lowe fell out with Nigel Farage and the party. And on the way out, it wasn't sufficient for Farage to take the whip away from him. They trumped up, in my view, both criminal as well as other charges against Rupert, which I think is repugnant. It's repugnant to do that to a man. Fine, you fall out, kick him out of the party, remove the whip. But then to try and ruin a man by making, in my view, a vexatious police complaint is absolutely unacceptable.
So Ben, why do prominent business people like yourself get involved with backing Nigel Farage's various parties if the danger, if you fall foul of the man's ego, is so significant reputationally and financially?
So, frankly, I refused to join Reform initially when Richard Tice invited me to join, because of Nigel Farage, and I wrote Richard Tice an email, actually on the 16th of March 23, saying I was not going to resign. I was not going to join, sorry, and I set out my reasons for them, all of them relating to Farage, and fundamentally resting on this one point, that Reform is controlled by Nigel Farage. He was the majority shareholder in the company that is Reform UK Limited, and therefore without a democratization of the party, in my view, couldn't succeed. And in the end, Richard Tice effectively convinced me that I should rely on his representations, that the party would be run on consensual lines. And the miscalculation I made, Nina, was that Nigel Farage would come back. Nigel Farage had told me unequivocally in late 2020 that he wanted to make money. He wanted to leave the political battlefield, if you like, and go and make money. And I calculated in early 23, after Richard Tice spoke to me, that, okay, fine, he won't democratize the party, but he won't come back. And it's Richard Tice's show. And Richard Tice understood, and I think still understands, the importance of a broad and deep team. And, Farage isn't there. As you can see, Nina, even now, all you see on telly is Farage, 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 Farage. You don't see multiple characters being developed. You don't see the formation of a possible government. You don't see people who are capable of running a government. You just see Nigel Farage. That could change. Of course, that could change. But this leopard is quite aged, and this leopard has yet to change its spots. So we'll find out.
Well, can I just put the counter argument to you? I'm sure Nigel Farage will say that he is probably the greatest political communicator in Britain of his generation, that he has, arguably, without him, Brexit wouldn't have happened. That he has got this astonishing being on the verge of breaking a two-party system that's been in place for over a century, and all the other Richard Tices and Richard Lowes and these people just don't add up to anything. I mean, compared to his capacity to control the media narrative and get his message across.
And I would absolutely endorse everything you said. However, if you wish to be in government and you wish to run a serious government, a government that can actually deliver for the country, it cannot possibly be down to one raconteur. Nigel Farage hasn't held any serious office. Let's just understand this. Last time he did anything to make money or, really got his hands dirty working hard was when he was, I think, a TikTok guy on the floor of life, that was like 30 years ago or something. If he's going to form a serious government, he needs some really capable people alongside him, whether they come from the defense sector, the health sector, private business, finance, whatever. He needs to develop people and he needs to get them into the public domain. He needs the people of the United Kingdom to know them. He's a fantastic campaigner. And there's only one other campaigner that comes close to Nigel Farage, and that is Boris Johnson. And Boris Johnson won a thumping majority in 2019. And what happened to the country after that? It was a disaster under Boris Johnson. In my view, all promises broken, including the one to deliver Brexit, which was a promise to deliver the country out of the EU as one United Kingdom. Boris Johnson didn't do that. He made a complete hash of the whole thing. And so I think it's very dangerous when we, the British people, follow an individual like Boris Johnson or Farage without looking at what else is going on around them. They're great campaigners. I agree with you, Owen. Arguably one of the best communicators in modern British political history, perhaps the best. But that doesn't change the fact that you have to have other heavyweights around you.
Ben, two questions. One, who did you vote for in the last local elections that took place to give rise to this reform quake, as Nigel Farage calls it? And two, do you think that we could see Boris Johnson team up with Nigel Farage to try and vie to create a conservative and reform government, a bit like what we saw in Canada in the 1990s?
Well, answering the first one, I didn't vote because I'm in the process of setting up my own party at the moment, which leaked. I had wanted to keep that secret until I'd got all my ducks in a row, but somehow it got out. And I don't think there's any prospect of Boris Johnson ever joining Nigel Farage. The animosity between the two is large.
Well, that was Ben Habib there, a businessman who was the former co-leader of the Reform Party, who's setting up his own party now to challenge Nigel Farage in this ever-splintering British political system that we have. Owen, we should talk about the wider picture here, because over the last couple of weeks, we've seen two distinct things emerging in terms of political trends. One is that in Canada and Australia, incumbents were kept against the odds because everybody was rallying against the Trump-like movement. And across the rest of Europe, we're still seeing these insurgent parties like Reform, Rassemblement National, the AFD. There was a big win for a presidential candidate from an insurgent party in Romania this week. They are still capturing about a third of the vote. So what are their policies?
Right. So it's interesting listening to Gawain Towler there. He was basically saying that there are different national cultures in each place, therefore these right-wing parties have different agendas. I don't see it quite like that. I think some of them are using different tactics to get to power, and that's partly a result of electoral systems and just sort of objective factors which determine the way they are tacking to win power. So if you take two issues, mass deportation and attitude to Ukraine and Russia, there are a number of these parties that remain pro-Russia. Trump in America, AFD in Germany, in the Netherlands, Geert Wilders still basically very supportive of Russia, do trade with Russia, lift the sanctions with Russia, however it's worded. There are others who've moved from that position. Maloney, when she came into power, was thought to be pro-Russian. She has turned out to be very pro-Ukraine. Nigel Farage, who we've been talking about, described him, Putin in very positive terms. He's now moving towards a Ukrainian position, saying that the lands that Ukraine has had taken off it by Russia should not be ceded, and that the Trump plan is too favourable to Russia. So you see these different trends emerging, and I think we're now at the point where we need to distinguish between these parties. I mean, Le Pen took Russian money and is now quite critical of Putin. So there are different ways these people are trying to get to power, and some of it involves sustaining their hard line, some of it involves tacking to the middle.
Yeah, I think you're right. And, we're seeing that in a change of language, aren't we, in terms of how we describe these parties. Nigel Farage's former spokesman, Gawain Towler, there very clearly said, we're not far right, we're not even hard right. And some of our economic policies were further to the left. We just want to stand up for the average person that feels like they're left behind. And that is the sort of simplistic populist message. He said more or less, we're pragmatists and there's no point in labelling us on either end of the political spectrum. I think that's probably because mainstream mainstream parties of either end of the political spectrum just aren't delivering, and lots of these parties are a protest vote from people who aren't necessarily ideologically right or left or otherwise. In terms of language, we had a really interesting thing that happened this week in the German parliament and also in the broader intelligence sphere in Germany. The Domestic Intelligence Agency published a 1,100 plus page report in which it deemed the AfD, the far-right Alternative für Deutschland party that came second in the federal elections just a couple of months ago, as being an extremist organisation. And we have this really dangerous scenario, don't we, where these insurgent parties now are finding that 30-odd% of the population, between 25 and 30% of the population, are actually voting for them. In the case of the Romanian presidential election, in the first round, a candidate who is far-right was voted for and won that first round. And then you can't just suddenly negate the voice of these 25, 30% of the people and say, well, that party is an extremist and potentially it's a danger to our society, when people expressed their democratic view.
Well, it may be a danger to society. You never know. I mean, that's what we saw in Germany before the war. But I mean, yeah, you're right. Do you do it on the basis of policy, or do you do it on the basis of public support? And I can see there is a difficulty there. I mean, is it at all appropriate to call a party that's getting 25, 30% far right? Well, in terms of the electorate, it's become centre-right, just like we heard Gawain Towler say. But, or should you judge it on policy positions, mass deportations, attitudes to Russia, and various other things you could cite? And should that be the yardstick you use to determine the language? Just one other thing before we close. I'd just like to get your take on this, because you're very up on European politics. Gawain Towler, in his answers there, was basically, it was class war. They look down on us. It's the people at the bottom. It's the people who've been ignored. The European elite, they marry each other. They're completely cut off, all this stuff. That's how he sees it from the UK with reform. I mean, is Le Pen, Maloney, AfD, are they all fighting, Vox in Spain, are they fighting class war like this?
I think a lot more of the rhetoric that we're seeing in some of these European countries that, by the way, turfed out the Ancien Régime that he was talking about, Gawain Towler, thanks to the French Revolution. I think what they are concerned about is that there are fewer and fewer resources, and that sharing more and more of those resources in economies that aren't growing, with large numbers of immigrants who are coming and seeking asylum, and that there's no control over this, I think that is an argument that they're managing to get a lot more traction on. But fundamentally, what none of this does is answer the question that you need economic growth to keep people happy, whether they're from the right, left, centre, fringes or wherever. And all of these Western societies have a fundamental problem, and that is that young people now who are born will not have a better quality of life than their parents. That is certainly the economic argument that somebody like Marine Le Pen focuses very heavily on. In that interview with Gawain Towler, you could hear that he was referring to her more protectionist stances, saying that she was actually economically far further to the left than where reform would be. That's logical because France is a more naturally socialist country. And in Germany, I think it's more nuanced as well, because the economy that was once the envy of Europe is now in reverse gear and really firmly stuck in the doldrums. So if the economy in Germany doesn't grow, if the economy in France doesn't grow, you're going to continue to see this sort of pressure on resources, and that's largely an immigration issue rather than one that's to do with class warfare that we still have in the UK.
Yep, it's all about class here.
Well, that's it for this edition of Control Alt Deceit. It was produced by Piers Lynch and presented in association with Democratis. I'm Nina Dos Santos.
And I'm Owen Bennett-Jones. And if you want to stay up to date with updates about next episodes and more, we can be found on Twitter or X. The handle there is @control_danger. It's rather difficult. @control_CTRL_danger. But that's it for this episode. So thanks for listening. And from Owen and Nina, goodbye.
Goodbye.